China has 56 recognised nationalities. If you are a keen reader of the news, you probably know about at least 3 of them. There are the Han, who make up the majority of the country, along with the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. If you're particularly into history, you've probably heard of the Mongolians as well, and maybe even the Manchu. However, that still leaves 50-something ethnic minority groups that we in the West just never really hear about. And I wanted to know more about them. So I have invited on Dan, a comedian based here in Beijing. Dan also happens to be a member of the Yao minority group, which is, I have to be honest, an ethnic minority group that I had never heard of prior to meeting him. Dan grew up in a county in southern China that is designated as an ethnic minority county. We're going to get into what that means in the show. He also attended an ethnic minority boarding school here in Beijing. So I thought he was a great guy to have on the show to tell us what life is like for the ethnic minorities we in the West just never really hear about. Hope you guys enjoy. Okay, welcome to the show, Dan. Do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel. I'm Chinese. I'm a comedian. I'm a comedy writer and a social media editor who live here in Beijing. And most importantly, I'm a racial minority in China.
Yeah, because that's why I wanted you on today, because I feel like 99.9% of Westerners, we kind of like know the Chinese racial makeup in China is like what, 93, 94% Han, and we know that there are other minorities in China, but for most of us, it's like we know the Tibetans, we know the Uyghurs. If you're really into history, you might know the Mongolians, you might know the Manchu, but that's kind of where most Westerners' knowledge of minorities ends. And I think that's a shame because there's lots of different cultures, minority cultures here in China, and we don't really hear all that much about it in the West. So I wanted you on to talk a little bit about your personal experience because you are a member of a minority that I think most Westerners will have never heard of. So maybe you could start by just telling us, like, who are the Yao?
So actually, that's like a really interesting question that I haven't personally haven't thought about for like a really long time in my entire life. Because I think like because of the like revolution, especially if you are one of the like smaller minorities that don't necessarily have like a very distinguished and like culture, let's say like the like Mongols or like Tibetans, you kind of grow up just like don't realize you are a racial minority because I come from like the south part of Hunan province and like come from a very small town. I used to joke I come from a small village of 1 million people. I recently actually looked up my entire county actually only have 500,000 people. Um, so when I grow up, like obviously everyone around me is Yao,
Well,
right?
I actually looked this up. Your home county of Jianghua actually has one of the highest uh, percentage concentrations of Yao of anywhere in the world.
Yes, yes. So like when you grow up in an environment like that, you don't really feel like special. I remember the first time I was distinguishedly reminding myself that I'm Yao is I think when I was like in my elementary school, we learned about like China is a Han majority place. And then I was like, wait, am I Han? And then my mom said, no, you're not, you're Yao. And I was like, that's bad. I don't want to be the small people. I want to be the big group. And then my mom was like, no, you don't understand. It's great to be Yao. Because when you go to like Gaokao, which is the most important exam in China where you decide if you can get into college or not, being Yao give you 10 extra points. And then coming from a racial minority special region give you another 10 points, which means like I was born with 20 extra points that no one else get. And my mom was like, that's a great thing. Don't be stupid. And that's
Well,
like literally my first interaction with like my like racial identity.
well, that's really interesting because I think in the West, often if you read a lot of China news, you hear a lot about, we're told a lot about the Han population or the majority, and that this often leads to problems with the minority. We have this term that's been bandying about in the last couple of years of like Han supremacy. There's a revival of Han culture, and that this is quite makes life a bit more difficult for racial minorities in China. Did you ever feel any of that growing up?
Like yes and no. So like I come from a very small village who live in the mountains. So the first time I feel like outside is when my family moved from the village to the small town. So when you're in the small town, I obviously have a very strong regional mountain accent. And then like I feel really bad for a while. But like that have this don't really have anything to do with people being Han or not.
What it sounds like is like your experience growing up was more of a class conflict than a racial one, just because there's not that many Han people about. But
Well,
like,
because I think no one would like know you if you are Yao. Because I
hmm,
think for like I think like again, if you are a few of the specific racial minorities, people won't recognize you if you are
so
a racial minority or not. And also China, I will make the argument, is actually very, very politically correct. So the idea of Han supremacy is like, at least in the education system, it's like no existing because everything you learn about like racial minorities, like we are the 56 flowers of the nation and we're all important, right? So like my first interaction with like racial or politics more specifically is when I graduated from my middle school and went into a high school. And my high school is one of the few high school in China that's a minority only high school. I had a very strong memory of during the military training for the high school. You know, like in China, before you go to high school, there's like a military training. Uh, we all have to went to a special place for the training, and our coach or trainer or commander, depends on how you call it, is Han. And it's very funny because like during the military training, it's very like, oh, you pussies. It's very like macho, like military training reserve vibe. And the first encounter we had is like we were trying to do some sort of exercise, and the guy isn't very happy with us, and then he shouted out like, "You pigs!" And one of my ethno minority, like because everyone's minority, one of them is actually like Hui from the Muslim region, actually stand up and say, "I'm sorry, man, like I'm a racial minority and pig is a word you shouldn't say to my racial minority." And then it's the first time in my life I see someone like from the military doing the training immediately apologize. I'm very sorry that I said that, like that's not my intention. I shouldn't have called you pigs. I meant pussies. I think you are pussy. That's
you're
it's
still
very
terrible, but I didn't mean pigs
I didn't
specifically.
mean pigs because I have to be respectful to racial minorities. So, like from my personal experience, I would make the argument that, like, obviously, if you are like certain, let's say, if you are more on the fringe, right? If you are from the Uyghur region, if you are from Tibet, if you are like kind of come from the culture that's slightly more distinguished from like the traditional like the mainstream Han culture, like mainstream, I won't say Han, mainstream China culture. Uh, like my entire life, I've never encountered any racial resentment or anything really, because like if you tell any Chinese people that you are a racial minority, the first thing is like, oh, cool.
Well, and the school, this minorities only school, like why does it exist? What's the purpose of it?
It was like a special program created by the Racial Minority Bureau. So it's actually linked to the 20 points I get from for Gaokao. Because when China was first founded, like it was very aware that a lot of racial minorities kind of like are in the most like the economic disadvantaged area. Because before New China, like my racial minority are basically like tribes deep in the mountain. So there was quite a concern, I would say, about like from my knowledge of like like one culture like dominate everything, and there was a very big push to be very inclusive and to be like treat every like racial minority equal to kind of like reach the branch out. And as part of that, like because in China when Gaokao come back, uh, in order to like help areas that's like more disadvantaged, like if you are like a racial minority, it's recognized that you are born into a bit of an economic disadvantage, and as a compensation, you get extra points for the Gaokao to help with your education and your like future. And if you are a minority special region, then you get extra points.
Right, okay. And did you find the education system at the high school pretty inclusive? Like, because it sounds like it comes from a really good place, right? It's this idea of we'll get economically disadvantaged racial minorities and we'll give them special educational treatment, right, so they can overcome poverty.
Yeah.
But did you find that's what it did? Like, was it a good school? Like, was the experience of the school an inclusive one?
Yes, yeah, because I think partly because it's a minority like area. Like it's a
Hmm.
minority only high school. But even before that, like my middle school, which is not like every school you go to, every college you go to, like there's no reason to be not inclusive. You know what I mean? Like if you go
Yeah.
to
Well.
like you teach in a university, they have a Qingzhen, which is they have like a Muslim only like restaurant,
Yeah, you
and
get
you can eat there as well. You just can't bring certain food into that canteen.
yeah, and they get special time off for Ramadan and stuff like that at my
Yeah,
university.
yeah. And
Yeah,
I
well,
will make the argument that like China is actually very, very politically correct. It will be really weird if a teacher came out like, oh, the minority like talk bad about the minorities.
well, the reason I bring it up is because I think in the West, our exposure, I guess, to residential schools for minorities is pretty universally negative, right? In places like Australia, Canada, America, this long history of residential schools being a place where racial minorities go to. They have this phrase, it's what is it? Kill the Indian, save the man. They're being sent
Mm,
to these residential schools to lose everything about their home culture and to become white people, right? They're going to learn how to
yeah.
be proper Westerners. And so I was asking because this is a residential school system for minorities. Like when you were at the school, you're saying, like, did you have the opportunity to practice Yao culture or embrace Yao culture or
Uh,
experience like minority culture there?
well, if it's a Chinese high school, you hardly have time for anything. So, so I suppose like following what you were talking about, uh, I think part of the difference is that the Chinese minority program didn't come from a colonial history. I like because New China is funded by after the idea of 100 year of humiliation, then the collapse of like I think like China as like an ancient civilization. So kind of coming out of that, it's really hard to promote like certain racial dominance because like when the Japanese invaded us, it's not like the Manchus did well. It's not like the Han people was like supreme in any way or form. So after that, particularly as a background, because I think compared to like let's say Australia, like there is a white dominance coming in considering they are the civilization. Where in
Hmm.
China, like the Han dominance was shattered.
Oh
It
yeah,
was
so
shattered like
I
it was
mean,
shattered by the Qing dynasty already,
yeah, I
and
was
then
going to
shattered
say,
even more by the Japanese invasion. So after that, like the entire China project is like what went wrong with our history. So like obviously you still do encounter like let's say Manchu supremacist people online or like Han supremacist people online, but like it's silly. It's like well like if the Han culture was so important or dominant, like why did the Second World War happen to us? Like that's silly.
I did fall into the rabbit hole on Xiaohongshu, the app, where I came across the area of the Chinese internet that are still dreaming of the Manchu homeland in Manchuria, and it was all like just weird Second
Yeah, yeah,
World War
yeah.
nostalgia stuff. It was very odd
And
actually.
also like nostalgia for what? Like
Oh
what?
sure, yeah.
Like what's so like? Why are you so proud of being like a Japanese puppy state? Like what's so like? It would be really weird. Like such small potato to be proud of. So like so I think that's fundamentally why I think like even like if you meet people who are like happy or the most important one, you're like that's kind of lame. Like it's like no one really takes very seriously, I think.
Well, yeah, and I think it's an important point you bring up that the unlike in say like Australia, America, Canada, where white people are still extreme, like still on top, right? There's still a lot of racial benefits here. for the last time that the Han were like racially on top is the 1600s because the
You have to
empire.
go back to the Ming Dynasty.
Yeah, yeah, because the Manchu Empire was a racial hierarchy, but it was a racial hierarchy for Mongolians and Manchu, who are
Yeah,
currently one of the minorities, right? And then, as you say, the Republic's doing something else, right? It's too busy getting invaded by Japan, and then the People's Republic, as you've brought up, makes this point of everybody's equal, and we're going to like stress it to quite a big degree, right? They like kind of
yeah.
almost they seem to me. It seems that especially in the initial years, the People's Republic kind of goes out of its way to demonstrate that everybody's equal and we're all in this together.
Yeah, because the racial minority region specifically, I think you have to be a racial minority to be like the mayor.
Well, I know it's very controversial in Inner Mongolia, for example, where I think 50% of the delegates to the National People's Congress or to the government have to be Mongolian, even although only 20% of the population are Mongolian. And so I know, like, obviously they're being overrepresented in numerical terms, but they get that because it's Inner Mongolia, it's their regional area. And I know, I
Yeah,
think a
yeah.
similar thing happens in the Hui region as well, where the Huis are actually quite a small percent in percentage terms of the population, but tend to be overrepresented. And as you say, in your county, you have to
Not
be,
us, we're 80%.
yeah, but you still, like, from what you're saying, if you wanted to become the mayor of Zhonghua, you'd have to be Yao, right? Like, you would have to have
Yeah.
some kind of connection there, which is not really what we think about when we think about Chinese racial, in the West, what we think about it at all. The idea
Uh,
of there being racial quotas is not, I think, what we think about.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
And so you went to the high school. You graduate from the high school. Do want to learn a little bit more about like your home county, this place where it's 80% Yao. You said that growing up you don't really feel that different from the Han. Like people wouldn't know that you weren't Han if you didn't say. But I'm still kind of curious. Like if we went to Zhanghua together, like how would we know it was a minority county, right? Like, how would it look different? Would the people be speaking their own language? Would it be their own dialect? Like, how is it different?
How do I put it? Like when I went to high school, when I come to Beijing, it's actually the first time I got like a racial minority clothes. Yeah, because before that, like I grew up in the 90s and China is not, and I come from a quite poor region of China. So it's not like we're super rich. So when you grow up, you got the clothes you get. Like my grandma had like minority clothes, but that's not very practical. So like everyone's just like we are actually now seeing more like a renaissance of that now. Because when I grow up, like it's a racial minority clothing. It's not like you don't promote that. It's really just like it's very formal wear. Unless you are a politician going to the National Congress or you are some sort of performer, there's no reason for you to have like the racial minority clothes because they are quite hard to get and very expensive.
It's a bit
And
like we could say in Scotland we have this with like the
kilt.
kilt and tartan
Yeah,
and
yeah.
stuff like this, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So when I went to high school, our high school actually specifically asked everyone to bring like minority clothes because every year during the sports event we will have to dress up.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah. Our high school like sports event is menace. It's like it's an asset trip. You just see all the minority people dancing around and like there's a parade. It's crazy. So actually like I would say like how do you recognize like my hometown's Yao? Uh the street is cleaner
Why is
because we
that?
have because we have extra funding.
Oh, you
like
get extra
like
funding.
yeah, so our county is actually one of the more like developed one in the region because we do get a lot of like actual funding from the government.
Is that because
And
you're a minority county?
yes, yeah. So like the country next door don't have the same like good street that we do. And then another thing is you see statues
Which is of who?
of just like a drum. Like we have the Yao drum. Like so the thing about Yao people is we like silver. So we have like silver like headpiece and we don't eat dogs because I think dogs are our spiritual animal or the totem. And then we have long drums that we can dance to.
Oh,
And we have a lot of bamboo related stuff.
and you said that the Yao are going through a bit of a renaissance down there in Jianghua recently. Is that right? Why is that? Why is that came about?
Well, it become a trend. Like people now have more disposable income.
Hmm.
So like more people will be like, instead of, showing up to event with like suits, because like suit also don't have a culture in China. Like in China, the formal wear is kind of like your traditional clothes. So when the county have like special events or like just like during festival or like New Year, people just dress up. Like it's kind of coming back like as part of the, I won't say cosplay, but like people are more kind of embracing, like including part of that into your day-to-day life. Like if there's a special event, you can just like dress up, yao, and that will be like fun. And
And is there a
particularly we as a minority county are also we're trying to become a tourist attraction. So they're like, well, if everyone more people show like wear Yao clothes, we look more authentically Yao, I suppose.
and is there a Yao language? Like, are people speaking their own language down there?
In where I'm from, we have a saying is every 10 miles people speak a different tune. Because I think that's like a very, how do I put it? Um, I think like in China, the racial definition is a bit different from let's say America. I'm sure not all Indian Native Americans are all from the same tribe and speak the same language.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But I think when we think about race, let's say in the traditional Westerns, it's like if you are from Scotland, then or if you are from like if you're American, but you can also be from like Germany, right? So like I think there's like an idea of like each race have its own dialogue. But for us, most of the time we're tribes. If you're a tribe, like whatever language you speak, unless you are like a very big race, then you can't quite maintain a language. So I think our language is kind of like a pigeon Chinese.
Right. So you're saying, yeah, I guess that's really interesting. I guess I've never really thought about it that way, but like China, uh, a lot of our racial categories come from like out of nation states, right? You're your own
Yeah.
ethnicity, so you should have your own nation state. That's how Europeans think about it. But you're saying like in China or in Chinese history, that's not always the
No,
case.
but I saw in like human history, like
Hmm.
that was the case. Like people don't like suddenly speak a different language
Well, I always think
and
it's
and
weird
live
when you
among
see
each other.
these.
Like that's not what happens. People always blend the language together.
Yeah, that's true. And I think it's you always see these maps going about on social media from like uh China being broken into 100 different places, right? Where it's like, oh, we have a Han country and we should have a Tibetan country and a Manchu country and all that kind of thing. And I always think it's a bit weird because it kind of suggests that like liberal Westerners think that every country needs to be like a ethno state.
Yeah, yeah. It's like segregation now, segregation forever. Like
Yeah.
that's weird.
So
Uh,
actually, though, I do have a question because you do say that.
can I finish the one about language?
Yeah, yeah.
But you do kind of have a sense of the tune. So it's a bit like Chinese, but with a strong accent,
Mhm.
right? It's like you're from Scotland. It's the same like when people listen to Scottish people speak English, that like I can understand. It's technically still English, but like
Hmm.
it's a very strong accent. So it's the
Yeah.
same, and you can actually trace our accent to see where the tribe go.
And where did it come from?
So we were originally from north of Hunan. So if you trace the accent, so it actually have always been fascinating to me is that when sometimes I travel in China, like when I go north, I would go to an area where they're like, hey, like your accent is a bit close to mine. And then when I go to like Guangxi, there will be a few places where I'm like, huh, my tune is a bit like the local tune. And even if you go to Yunnan, there are still a few tunes that I can recognize. I'm like, hey, I speak the same tune. Apparently, what happened was, I think it's like going to like racial like fight is we used to live in the north of Hunan, and then through the kind of Han Dynasty expansion, we over like several hundred years slowly move from like north of Hunan to south of Hunan, then went to Guangxi province, and then went all the way to Yunnan. So like if you trace the accent, you can trace like how the tribe have moved, because when the tribe moves, like people left behind and then like form new tribes.
Oh, that's really cool. And that's like the thing that's always like really fascinating about China is like just the depth of the history. Because you're talking now about the Han Dynasty. This is a process that started what 2,000 years ago, and it still
Yeah,
has
yeah, yeah.
effects in the tones and the language and dialect that's being spoke down there, which is really
Ye-
cool.
Actually, that's something kind of linked back to like why do you not feel special? Like about like what it feels like to be like Yao. It's like I remember I was like in the Hunan museum, and it's talking about like like it's talking about like artifacts that dig out, and then the history. And then at some point they keep mentioning like the dynasty is kicking out the Man, which you can translate into barbarics. And then there's basically in that museum, there's an entire section of just kicking the barbaric styles. And then at some point realize, oh, we are the barbaric. I am the descendant of the barbarics. But like, I think if the same language is used, let's say outside of China, people will find that controversial, because to use like the word barbaric to describe a racial minority is like in the world of political correctness, it's not very politically correct. I think it's because we went through this kind of reconstruction of like racial politics. Like we kind of don't live in necessarily the danger of like being a minority. So when I see that, I just feel like, oh, that's just like historical words. That just kind of like that's what was written in the history books.
Yeah, and I think like it's an interesting point, right? Because I think it's about the word can be funny or threatening depending on the context. So, for
Yeah.
example, if I went to Italy and I went to a museum about the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire Museum was talking about how the Romans had attacked the barbarians in northern Britain, and I went, they're talking about me. I'm going to find that funny, right?
Yeah,
Because there
exactly.
isn't a threat that the Italians are going to reappear and invade Scotland. Whereas I could understand that if you were, say, a Native American and you went to a museum in Washington, D.C., and they're talking about Native Americans as barbarians, that's not funny because the genocide, the oppression is still going on in America.
They still live in the consequence of it, and
Yeah.
I suppose from my experience we live in a different consequence of it. Like we live in the reconstruct like after the new China phase.
So
I
would you
think that's
say,
why I don't feel threatened by that kind of language, and I find it funny.
yeah, so would you say, like, it sounds like what you're saying is like 1949, the Declaration of People's Republic of China is a real hinge point when it comes to minority relations in China. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, yeah, I would say, because before that we were the barbarics.
Is it?
Yeah.
So I actually do have a question though, because we've been talking a lot about like you don't feel particularly different from other Chinese people. It sounds like you're saying like you're kind of like a silent minority. But you do, as you said, get benefits for being Yao and Jianghua. You get those Gaokao points, you get extra funding. And the county next door that is not majority Yao doesn't get that funding, doesn't get those Gaokao points. So I guess my question is like, do you think there is any resentment from the Han people down there against you guys? Because I say this because I'm from Britain
Uh,
and we have a lot of
yeah.
like white resentment coming to the fore just now, and I put that hat on. I'm wondering like, how is it in China? Like, do you feel there are people who are like, why are these guys getting more money than we are? Why are they getting the Galco
Uh,
points?
yeah, my high school used to have a annual protest outside of our high school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because we actually have like our high school actually have very high rates of people getting to elite universities, and we have a special program where we are not from Beijing, but we take the Gaokao as a Beijing student. So a lot of Beijing's parents were upset. I think they called the government to complain about us on an annual basis, and and I said yes. So I think that's why we can like see this slow like roll back.
It's certainly
Like
been.
so when I grow up, I can get 20 points. I think if you do it today, you get 5 to 10.
You think that's in response to like non-minority protests, like seeing that's unfair.
I think that can come from the grander movement of like new development countryside. So I think like I think the difference is we for a long time did get a lot of compensation. And now like there's a grander project of like develop everyone. Because especially that policy has been in for like 50 years. Like entire I won't say 50, probably 50. Like an
Longer.
entire generation, 1, 2 generation of people have benefit from it.
Mm.
And so like now after like the new like countryside development project, like a lot of the reasoning of giving that special benefits isn't there anymore, if that makes sense. It's like you like Jianghua as like a county compared to the other Han County isn't particularly poor anymore.
Oh, so there's been a
Like
change even since like when you were growing up then.
yeah, so like after the development, like I think the kind of understanding is like the new approaches we're gonna develop all rural area, no matter like the racial politics.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, right? I think where it's like um, the special treatment comes about because the Yao, for historical reasons, on average are poorer than the Han, and so they get special treatment. And you're saying like in the 2020s, the policies of the Chinese government have solved that problem. Now the Yao and the Han are kind of equal in many more ways than they used to be. And so now there's that rollback because they're like, okay, this policy's worked, we fixed it. Now we need to focus on something else. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it wasn't like overnight. It was like gradual. It was like a small, like slow rollback, like over like 10 years.
Mm.
So it wasn't like and also it wasn't particularly because of like racial resentment. It's not like we ever had like a Han complaining about racial minority movement. Like it's not, it's very kind of apolitical. It's just at some point, like I just like, oh, this policy doesn't really make sense anymore. So it's just kind of like slowly like rolling back. And it's a very like, how do I put it? It's a very like case by case kind of situation because different regions are rolling back at different speed based on the local response.
Yeah, and how do the Yao themselves feel about this rollback, right? Because you seem pretty positive about it. You're like, problem solved, we don't need this solution anymore. But how, like, in Zhanghua, like, what's happening down there? There must be at least some people who are like a little bit anxious about losing losing these benefits they've had for decades and decades.
So I think the funding are still there. I think it was particularly the education bit, like I'm aware that was kind of
Hmm.
more gone.
So originally I was asking if there was any resentment from the, like, how do Yao people themselves feel, or minorities more generally feel about the changes in the last 10 years or so to the minority system? Because in the West, I think there's a lot of reporting on it, and I think it, from what you're saying, it sounds a little bit like it comes because in the West we never solve these problems. So people changing it always feels bad to us.
I think context really matter in this scenario. And that policy rollback did not, at least from where I come from, did not come from, there was never the danger of like, now that first they're going to take off our points, next thing they're going to like treat young people badly. Like that was never a movement we had to face, right? So like, and then that policy rollback is like extended to 10 years, which is very smart because no parents, because like your kids gonna lose a few points. So
That's
like no
exactly
one
true.
lost all that 10 points overnight.
Mm.
So like in that process, it's like it doesn't feel like, so there was, at least for us, there was never the like Han people pushing back political movement. It's kind of apolitical. So you never feel the danger or the eager to push back. And also because the policy rollback is so gradual, there's also no reason for you to do that. I think for other region of China, specifically racial minorities that have a more distinguished, like, how do I say, cultural identity, there are probably more pushbacks.
Well, it sounds like the Yao are pretty well integrated into Hunan anyway. Or I shouldn't say integrated because you're from there, but like it doesn't sound like it sounds like there isn't, as you say, there isn't like a
We
um
never had a separatist movement,
yeah, and it's not clear
and
like.
that's partly why. I think.
And I think it's interesting as well because it sounds like what you're saying is that uh, the feeling among the Yao is that the Han pushback that I'm talking about actually on the ground wasn't so much people saying you should pay attention to Han. It was more like, well, maybe we should try this different policy. And that is different from how it often goes in the West, where white people, when they push back against DEI, are not saying, well, maybe we should try a different policy to get everybody going up. It's often code for, why are the white people being ignored? And that isn't happening in China.
Uh,
That's not what's happening.
I think for me, it feels like it's which story that you are part of. Again, certain racial minorities they have a different story,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
Like Mongol separatist movement come back. Their story is like we used to be the children of Genghis Khan, so maybe we can do that Chuan Asia empire again, which is kind of silly. But, but like anyway, so like I think that was more like that's your like racial minority have a grander story than the China story. So like for us, for a long time, we were never included by like any. We were not including the Han Dynasty. We were never included by the Manchu Dynasty. We are always on the fringe, and we're never belonging because like the region I come from is where we exile people to, right? Like 200 years ago. So like in this story we are told, the new China story, we are very much a part of it. So we're like very happy. But it's the first time I think like we are included in like a national story. So like we're happy about that. But I depends like if you have your own story, then like people
Yeah,
might have a
so
different perspective.
for the Yao, the new China Declaration of People's Republic was a process of being moved from the periphery into the centre of the story. Whereas I suppose for people like the Mongols or the Manchu, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, it might be a different story. That's not how they feel, or there is at least more contention with what was happening in that process.
Or that eager for a bigger story.
And I think that makes sense as to why in the West we often hear from, as you say, these people with a bigger story are often the people who break through into the West. So we've heard of the Mongols, we've heard of the Uyghurs, we've heard of the Tibetans. These are all groups with their own bigger story, maybe outside the China story, or one that could potentially be outside the China story. And we never hear from minorities like the Yao, like the others, who are like who have this process where the China story is very much one of them being uplifted, like coming into the story is a process of them being moved from the periphery into the centre. I think also from Westerners, I think we often do a little bit of projection, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
it's very difficult to imagine a nation building story in the West that is going to be inclusive of minorities. It's a very difficult thing to imagine. And so when we come to China, we project those anxieties often onto the minorities we encounter here. So when Americans are meeting you or Westerners are meeting you and saying, well, I don't understand, why are you saying these things? I think it's because they're projecting their own country's pretty terrible history with minorities onto China and therefore onto you. And so your story doesn't really make sense to them because it's like, well, why would a minority be saying these things about their host country? A minority in America or Canada or Europe would never do that.
Yeah, I think yeah, I think that was the big difference. It's like well, like our racial minority in China have a very different living experience.
I think it's because in the most Western countries, it's just impossible to imagine a situation where everyone's blended together and it is not a kind of white supremacist project. And so, as a reaction to that, in recent decades, there has been this move in the West that, well, we can't have everyone blended together. That ended badly. So let's try and just have everyone in their own corner doing their own thing. Um, yeah, so I think like when we come to China, I always tell this to fellow Westerners. It's important to, I think, meet China on its own terms rather than coming with trying to come to China and see, oh, well, okay, so who are their white people? Who are their black people? Who are their Native Americans? Like, don't do that. Instead, come to
Yeah.
China and go, well, this is China. It works differently. They have a different history. They have a different political setup. Like, just see it on its own terms. Talk to the people here. Listen to the different stories and then make up your own mind. Well, is there anything else you would like to say to the listeners before we go?
So that's something I kind of like always struggle with, because one of the reasons why we delayed this interview so much is because I don't feel like I know a lot about my racial minority. And I've been kind of like made to be a bit ashamed of that. It's like, well, you should know more. I'm like, do I need to? Like I feel like the need to like kind of identify yourself to be such a distinguished, like you just like, oh, you have to embrace your root. I'm like, I don't, like, fine. Like do I like I think that's what I say. It's like my attitude towards it, it's like I'm actually very careful of how much I want to dig into, because the Chinese man, like, we used to joke in China, racial minority are nice people who dance. That's the stereotype of like China's image of like racial minority. If you go to Chinese New Year Gala, every racial minority, we dance, we have fun costume, and we sing and dance, we're happy. But that's not who we really are. Yes, that's not who we really are. But like, I also don't think we need to be who we really are, because like I said, I was very anxious about like, if I dig too much into our history, how am I gonna like face the fact that our tribe used to do a lot of horrible things, and then try like the tribes between tribes fight, like my mom's tribes and my dad's side 100 years ago would never marry together, because one of them are in the mountain, one of them are not, and they probably dislike each other. Because like I still remember like my grandmas would just like send like little darts towards like my dad's family. So it's like there are a lot of like history there, but like it's okay to also not unpack it and just like move on.
Yeah, I think it's also there's a certain level of racism to asking minorities that you need to be en route with your own culture, because it's never something you would say about like a white guy from New York, right? Like you would never go.
Yeah,
You need to be en route. You need to be get in touch with your your heritage as a white guy in New York, or a white guy in London. Like it's not something you would ask that person to do. It's always something that is being asked of minorities, often by white people. And I think, like, yeah, you're right. Like, people should relate to their own culture in any way they want, or any way they don't want to, right?
yeah.
That's your right as
To
a
a lot
person.
of us, our racial identity is literally just a character on our ID.
It's a historical reality. Well, and I think that makes
We
sense
don't
from
think
our
about it sometimes.
conversation where you've said that there has been a lot of the things that would have made you distinct were a lot of poverty, right? That's what you were saying. And
Yeah,
as those disappear, the reason for that distinctness becomes a lot more blurred. Like, and I think like it's easy for us to see that as a sad thing, that the differences between cultures are blurring, but we could equally frame that as a positive thing, that cultures are blurring because there isn't racial tension anymore, there isn't economic tension, these groups are intermingling more, and so the differences are becoming much less. I mean, you can read that as sad that people aren't relating to their culture, or you could read that as a success. And I think it depends on the context, the person, the place you're in.
yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you for speaking to us.
Thank you. Bye
Bye.
bye.